There's a lot of focus on trying to shift policy, either at the level of national governments or at the international levels in things like COP. But there isn't so much of a understanding of how people can claim power on the ground to be able to assert their own decision-making processes, not constantly have to ask government
Right.
for doing what government should be doing, which becomes a powerful alternative both to authoritarianism but also to liberal Western forms of so-called democracy.
This is Marisol Cortez, Executive Editor of Deceleration at Deceleration.news. Today, we are excited to be speaking with Ashish Kothari, who is the founder of Kalpavriksh, a nonprofit organization in India that works on environmental and social issues at local, national, and global levels. Trained at the Indian Institute of Public Administration, he has coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and also served on the boards of Greenpeace India and Greenpeace International. I came across Kothari's work because, as an activist and thinker, he's been at the forefront of what's known as post-development perspectives, or alternatives to development, as the Colombian scholar-activist Arturo Escobar describes them in his book Pluriversal Politics. Although it's maybe been easier in the global south to see the ways that development has operated historically as a colonial paradigm, for many marginalized communities in the global north too, the dogged pursuit of something that we call economic development as the only way to create well-being has historically also been saddled with the inequality, displacement, and ecological damage it leaves in its wake. So a lot of communities around the world have sought to articulate their own indigenous or locally grounded ways of meeting human needs based on principles of justice, equality, and direct democracy, ones that are also in respectful relationship with ecosystems and more than human relatives. In India, Kothari is part of the coordination team for Vikalp Sangam, or Alternatives Confluence in Hindi. He is also a core member of a similar network of translocal alternatives across the global south, called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. And he's also cataloged many of these alternatives as the co-editor of a really fantastic book called Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary. It's a great introduction to post-development perspectives, not just theoretically, but also at the level of putting these ideas into practice. Even in environmental justice and climate justice movements, here in the US and the global north more broadly, we're just at the beginning of seeing how our struggles connect to broader global searches for alternatives to development. But as Kothari reminds us, we must always be saying no and yes at the same time, fighting back and fighting forward, fighting but also building, opposing, and creating alternatives. Thank you for being here and for listening. Here is Ashish Kothari from the Global Tapestry of Alternatives.
Firstly, thanks for inviting me to this platform. My work on this kind of started when I was in high school, um, almost 50 years back. When I was growing up in New Delhi, and we were seeing a lot of ecological issues coming up, the destruction of one of the world's largest urban forests, more pollution and things like that. So we thought that as students, as young people who are growing up in that city, we needed to not just watch what's happening, but do something about it. And so we actually did a series of campaigns, street demonstrations, campaigns, letter writing, and all of that on these issues. And that's when we started the organization that I still work with. It's called Kalpavriksh. It's a Indian environmental action group, but now 47 years old. And a lot of our earlier work was on kind of critiquing and resisting destructive forms of development and everything that goes with it, the sort of structures of the economy, structures of politics and governance, and how nature and the environment is treated in development or economic planning. So a lot of it was sort of critiques, but then we were also more and more in touch with grassroots movements who were resisting some of these projects and processes. And in those, we also found that people were working out their own alternatives, some of which are basically just saying we want to continue our own forms of traditional occupations or maybe hybrid occupations, but in
Mm-hmm.
our ways with our decision making. Some of them were maybe adopting some new things, but essentially all of them kind of rejecting what was coming to them from above, like top-down imposition of the economic development models,
Mm-hmm.
and also asserting that we want to be part of decision making. We don't want to simply accept what the government is telling us.
Right.
So, in that sense, right from the beginning, we were kind of exposed to both resistance and alternatives in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And really, it's only in the last maybe 15, 20 years that my and a group of us began to focus on alternatives on the yes part much more intensively and systematically. And we
Mm-hmm.
did a number of things. One was, of course, documentation of many of these initiatives at radical alternatives on the ground. But also, we felt that the huge gap was networking amongst these initiatives or between the resistance movements and the constructive alternative movements in India. And so, 2014, we began this national platform called Vikalp Sangam, or the Confluence of Alternatives, to bring together people working on all kinds of different subjects, agriculture and food, health, education, gender, justice, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's been going on for 11 years. And then 2016, 17, we also started asking similar groups and networks in other parts of the world about whether there was a felt need for a global platform with similar objectives. And almost unanimously, we heard yes. So that's why in 2019, we launched the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So, yeah, so
That's very
that's
cool.
in brief the sort of trajectory of where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like here a lot of what like deceleration has tried to do is really kind of document or hold a mirror to communities that are actually doing, creating alternatives, but they don't necessarily even think of what they're doing as the
Sure.
most significant thing,
Mhm,
right? I mean, they're
mhm,
they're fighting power. They're engaged in, they're doing the work of like a refusal or resistance or saying no, but they're also um it's sort of undersung, or it's under recognized that they're also just doing the thing that they think needs to be done, right? So some of the ways like that we've tried to like where we encounter those to write about them in the hopes that like some of that exactly like that network building or so that people can start sort of like connecting across these different areas that people organize in. Um,
I'm just to add there, yeah,
mhm,
absolutely essential that these are documented, and both because, like you're saying, people themselves who are doing it need to recognize the importance of what they're doing, but also, of course, others to know about them and to get inspired, especially because mainstream media tends to ignore a lot of these
mhm,
initiatives. But the second thing also we realized was that it was important to try and enable their voices to come out themselves. So
mhm,
not just people like us writing about them, but they themselves narrating. And now with so many different kinds of media available, that it's become much easier, whether it's audio or visual or art forms or many different forms in different languages. So that's also something we've been trying to do much more of in the last few years.
yeah. Um, and I'll maybe make a note to come back to that because I'd like to ask in a little bit like what that has looked like or what kinds of practices that has generated. But I did want to ask about uh, sort of GTA's involvement or in the People's Summit that just happened in Belem, Brazil, leading up to
Mhm.
COP30. I know that you organized conversations specifically around the connections between climate justice and then what you call radical democracy.
Mhm.
Can you say a little bit about what you mean by radical democracy as opposed to like liberal democracy or neoliberal democracy? And then why, in those conversations, you described it as the missing conversation of COP30. If you
Mhm.
can maybe talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, sure. So as well, even with our Vikalp Sangam process in India, but then increasingly with the GTA process, we felt that A huge chunk that was missing from a lot of civil society movements, not so much the indigenous peoples movements because they do have it, but more the sort of mainstream civil society movements was uh, there's a lot of focus on trying to shift policy, either at the level of national governments or at the international levels in things like COP, climate COPs and CBD COPs, etc. But there isn't so much of a understanding of or a belief in or a focus on how people can claim power on the ground to be able to assert their own decision making processes and not constantly have to ask government uh,
Right.
for for doing what government should be doing. In a sense, if you look at the indigenous self-determination movements in the last few decades in many parts of the world, or if you look at movements like the Zapatista in what is today called Mexico, or the Kurdish Rojava movement in Central Asia, and so on, you actually find that their concept of what democracy should be or is very different from the Western liberal forms of democracy. So, in many different ways, I mean, for instance,
Hmm.
elections are not at the core of decision-making processes. Decision-making doesn't happen in a centralized way, but in a distributed way. It's not based on majoritarianism, it's based on consensus, and so on.
Hmm.
Um, so we wanted to try and see how that flavor of what we think is real democracy could actually come into global processes like the COP. So early into 2025, in February, we actually had helped to organize a global gathering or global confluence of communities and indigenous peoples who are practicing or trying to practice radical democracy. That is to say, democracy on the ground, where
Yeah.
people are taking decisions, right? And about 20, 25 such communities had participated. And there were some incredible stories that were coming out of it. But it was also that how do we put these stories together into a cohesive narrative, which becomes a powerful alternative both to authoritarianism, but also to liberal Western forms of so-called democracy. Um,
Right.
which was then followed by another gathering that was held in Sydney on earthy governance and interspecies justice, because the second missing chunk we found was where how do other species, how does the rest of nature come into our decision making processes, into
Mm-hmm.
democracy? Why should it be only human centered, right? And again, we see in many indigenous peoples or other traditional communities that that voice of nature is there in one way or the other. It's implicit or explicitly there.
Hmm.
So, and what we call earthy governance or interspecies justice also coming into the radical democracy space. So these two gatherings actually then what we said was let's follow these two up with a session combining these with climate justice at the COP. So that's the sort
Hmm.
of journey to COP. And the session that we did in COP in Belem was, of course, quite small. It was just a half day session. There was already too many things happening already. So we did that and then kind of tried to feed some of that into the other people's processes that were taking place there.
Hmm. And then how did those conversations within the People's Summit go? Like, in what ways were they taken up by the charter that came out of the summit, and brought to to the main COP process?
I have to admit, not very well. One was we have the GTA is a very small team at the moment, and so there was only three of us there, and we were already doing a lot of things. So and the whole People Summit process was extremely confusing. I have to admit. I mean, it was fantastic in many ways, but very confusing to where to plug in what for us was quite difficult given the small team we were. So we did manage to bring a flavor of this into some of the People Summit processes, more the sort of local level parallel sessions that were going on, not so much in the open plenaries, unfortunately. So the declaration itself that's from the People Summit is very powerful in many ways, but sadly, this element is still weak. They're talking about participation and consent and consultation, all of which is important. But to actually get this flavor of what many peoples are saying is real democracy is not
Hmm.
really there. And I
Yeah.
think partly also it's because even though I'm very, sort of appreciative of what happened in the People Summit and the people who are organizing all of that, I think to some extent, insofar as the conventional left or some of the leftist movements were driving quite a lot of it, and they're extremely progressive and radical in many ways, but
Hmm.
there's still kind of, I should say, the focus is still very much on capturing the state or
Sure.
making the state accountable. And
Right.
we've seen that especially in Latin America
Hmm.
and some other parts of the world. No? So that's a bit of a continuing dialogue that we need to have, is to try and see how do we shift or complement that with the shift to actual people's power.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, and just in terms of like the official space of the COP, um, in its engagement with the demands coming from people's movements and indigenous movements. A lot of the news, of course, was deeply disappointing, but maybe not surprising.
Mhm.
Uh, was there anything that did surprise you about either the COP process or the outcomes or the People Summit process or outcomes, like in a good way?
Well, I think one of the most positive things of the COP, both the COP and the people's processes that were happening, there were three or four parallel processes that were happening outside. There was the whole indigenous cupola, there was the People Summit. So anyway, there were many things happening outside. What I found very positive was the very large number of indigenous peoples and other communities who were there. This is probably the first COP in which you have thousands of, and naturally, I mean, you're doing something in the Amazon. It's kind of natural and understandable that you'd have a very large presence, and that had its own that flavor kind of did creep into. Certainly, it crept into the indigenous into the People Summit,
Yeah.
to a little bit into the COP, not necessarily in the official final agreement, but in terms of Brazil, for instance, agreeing or maybe being forced to agree to recognize land rights claims, to reduce some of the objectionable projects in the Amazon, etc.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the official summit and whatever came out of it, I think the only thing that I find kind of somewhat positive is the focus on just transition.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first time that's come in. The understanding or the recognition that any transition that needs to take place has to take into account workers and other sort of people who are marginalized, because otherwise they are going to be doubly uh, negatively impacted in the transition. For instance, from fossil fuels to renewable energy, what happens to people in the mining sector, coal mining sector? What happens to people in power stations, thermal power stations, etc.? So this has been a strong demand and focus by workers groups and civil society organizations in the last more than a decade. And it's good to see that at least some of that language has come into the official process.
Mm-hmm.
What that means actually on the ground effectively, we don't know. But it's sometimes that language does help. It becomes a tool for people's movements to be able to use. But that's
Right.
probably the only thing. I don't know if there's anything else that you're right. You're right. It wasn't a surprise.
Yeah.
If it's taken 30 conferences of parties for governments to try and deal with the climate crisis, it means that there is an inherent flaw in the process and the governments cannot deal with it or don't want to deal with it. So we were certainly not expecting much. And GTA, in fact, didn't do anything at all in the official process at all, in the blue zone or anywhere else, because
Mm-hmm.
we didn't want to waste our time
Mm-hmm.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, for GTA or for your delegation that went to the People Summit and to COP, um, what do you think are the most important takeaways from those processes for communities um, that are sort of fighting on two fronts? On the one hand, we're fighting ecocide, we're fighting the impacts of climate change, climate violence, and the uneven ways that that plays out, like in communities, especially communities of color, global South, indigenous. But then on the other hand, a lot of communities around the world, including here in the US, are having to fight fascism too. We're fighting authoritarian state violence, ethno-nationalist state violence. Kind of based on your work, like what what advice or you know, what are communities doing that are engaged in that double kind of struggle, right? That that we should all be doing, essentially.
Well, I think I think if we're able to coordinate much better the different kinds of movements that are there around the world, even in a country, but certainly globally, the struggle to make governments and multilateral institutions like the UN or the conferences of parties, etc., more open and accountable is an important one. Needs to continue. But to my mind, we also need a lot more focus on providing the support for communities on the ground to become much more powerful, to have
Mhm.
their voice heard in their own local decision-making processes and also in other forums. And in that sense, I think things like the People Summit or the Indigenous People Summit are very useful because there is a possibility of building much more collaboration, much more alliances, much more solidarity, much more interconnectedness. I think we could do it better because even in something like the People Summit, and the same thing happens in the World Social Forum, people tend to go to their own comfort zones, and so the cross learning and cross connections and alliances that need to be built doesn't happen as strongly as it should be happening. I'm not quite sure how to break that problem, but certainly as part of the GTA, we would like to see that happening much more. We would like to see much more how indigenous peoples relate and work with, say, feminist organizations who work with, say, food sovereignty movements, who can work with alternative education movements, and who can work with workers movements, etc. So building that kind of cross solidarity, which then empowers and strengthens all of us to be able to resist what is coming at us like a bulldozer, but also to be able to show powerful alternative visions and practices. I think that's really, if at all, there's a value for having 50,000 people coming together at some point with all its climate costs and all of that. I think that's the main value that we should be focusing on much more.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's what enables us to resist fascism. It resists, I mean, everything that's happening in the world, right? But also always to be saying both no and yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and that's actually we started, I mean, I think we've been talking kind of about that throughout, but just sort of taking a deeper dive, like that was my trajectory, right? Like I came here in San Antonio, like in other places that I had worked in environmental justice organizing, we were constantly, we were saying no, 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 no. I mean, because there's always projects coming in, there's local, the logic of development here too, right, is imposed on communities of color, neighborhoods that have been disinvested for decades and decades, right? Like, and so like my involvement, my political activism came out of that, a lot of those fights over, building huge developments over our aquifer, the recharge zone of our aquifer, the city wanting to invest more money in nuclear power, the city's plans to redevelop downtown in ways that were displacing people in the neighborhoods like adjacent to downtown. And it was always the same fight, like it was always the same players, it was always the same kind of logic, it was always the same rhetoric that you heard about why they were doing these things. And I kind of just like hit a wall. And so deceleration grew out of that question of how do we, even as we are fighting these things, we don't want to not, oppose these projects or oppose this way of, of decision making or of governance. We also have to be doing work that we have to be doing work in a different way. We also have to be thinking about what are we actually wanting to build together and how can that work come from a place of, the joy of solidarity or out of desire for what we want, a longing for what we want. And I know you've written extensively on that, like in the Pluriverse, the post-development dictionary that you co-edited. So there's a lot of like examples there, of what that looks like around the world, right? But for environmental justice and climate justice movements in the global north, in the United States, I think especially, like it's very hard for people to keep their focus on the work of yes. It feels like we're so much of our energy is, and even in our work at Deceleration, like we're constantly having to fight against the tendency to just organize and think, and this is like something that I get from Escobar, right? Like on the same terms as the system that is causing the problem, right? it's very hard to like break away from that logic, from the logic of what you're fighting, right? And to just create the alternative. So I'm wondering, how can climate justice, environmental justice movements keep their focus, instead of doing like 75% no, 25% yes, how can we kind of move over time to doing like more of the yes?
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think there's two crucial reasons why we need to do a lot more of the yes. One is what you said, that for us also in terms of being able to sustain our own energy, to sustain our own inspiration and hope, and not burn out, not get into a mode of depression, etc., which is very easy these days, right? Because the world is burning. But the second crucial reason is, in fact, this was probably a bigger reason for us to not shift, but put much more focus in this 15 years back, was public outreach. People out there, let's say neutral people, okay, whatever, or those who are like saying, no, but we need development, and we need a central government to be able to do things. For them, for what they were seeing us was basically just obstructionist people. Many of them even liked us, but they still like, okay, you're just saying no, 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 no. Then what? So what's your vision if you don't like what the government is doing or what companies are doing? And in that sense, for much greater public acceptance of our struggles, even our no struggles, we need to have that positive message, and a solidly built positive message with stories, with examples, with everything. And to reach out with that, not just in academic ways, but in many different forms that reach people's hearts, also emotions, art,
Mhm.
songs, etc. So these are two crucial reasons that we have to be able to do this. Now, I find that perhaps the global north can learn a lot from the global south on this, because if you mentioned climate justice. Now, one of the most fascinating examples of what I just said is the climate justice charter movement in South Africa, which over a process of several years brought together feminist groups, ecological groups, all the big trade unions, youth groups, etc., to see if South Africa has to do a climate transition, what is the process that would be just for workers, which would be ecologically sound, etc., etc., right?
Mhm.
And beyond just a charter which is there, kind of working very detailed plans for each sector of the economy and society. It's currently hit a roadblock because politically that country is in a bit of a mess. But nevertheless, the process itself was very, very important, very affirming, because while there was resistance, there was an affirmative saying this is the vision that's coming from thousands of people from the grassroots, right? And different kinds of people collectively. Um, I'm so then there's many such processes happening in the global south. But even in the US, I mean, we've been in touch with groups like Cooperation Jackson,
Oh
uh,
yeah,
obviously
they're
a black
great.
resistance movement, but is also
Mhm.
a very positive, like, okay, here's setting up a cooperative for livelihoods and everything else, right? And
Mhm.
there's more. I certainly know many in Europe which are doing exactly that. So even from within the sort of belly of the beast, so to speak. I mean, from within capitalism and extreme
Mhm.
individualism and so on. Like in Germany, I visited three communes. There are 200 communes. I visited three of them, and how people are actually coming back to community life, sharing resources, sharing childcare and care of elderly without money coming into the picture, right? So I
Mhm.
think the more we're able to actually do this and also share the stories and get people to tell these stories across both global south and global north, I think the more people will actually sit up and say, oh, yeah, these guys are making sense. They're not simply obstructionists, they are actually also, and to show that people are happy with this. That happiness doesn't come from just shopping for more and more and more, but it also comes from having better social relations, more access to nature, and so much stuff, right? I mean, you could see, you go to a commune like that, you could actually see the positive energy so much more than in a colony which is extremely rich, but where everybody's living in fear. Everything is gated and there are guards and all that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
these are stories I think we need to share much more. And
Yeah,
for
yeah,
people.
definitely. And then just to come back to that point you were earlier, you were mentioning that a lot of what GTA is trying to do is not just, y'all are the ones archiving these stories or these examples, but also people kind of speaking for themselves. Um, sharing stories in their own forms and their own modes. What are some ways that you've seen that facilitated?
Yeah, I mean, now because people across the world have much more access to communications, technologies, and media, we have been helping. I mean, the GTA world, which is many, many groups across the world, have been helping with audiovisual messaging, with art coming out, with music, resistance music, for instance, or different kinds of songs and music, and combining old and new. For instance, there are movements in India, resistance and alternative movements that are bringing rap, which is not an Indian form of music, but then they're putting their own indigenous or local community voices and language and texts into that. So many different hybrid forms, and you can see that with the younger generation. I mean, so much more than maybe even in our case. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to enable, but also to enable these people to be in forums which normally they would not be in, including things like COP, right? Or governmental forums, just so that we're not representing their voice. They should be able to have that voice themselves. And that makes a huge difference. No?
Mhm.
But it means helping them to prepare what's the sort of language that could be used to get the confidence to be able to speak to people who they've always looked up as, oh my God, these guys are so powerful. How can we speak to them? So I think all of that is what we try and do. I should mention that GTA is a global platform, but for us it's very crucial that our constituencies are groups and movements and people who are rooted on the ground.
Right.
And until, I mean, unless whatever is global continues to stay rooted on the ground, it's going to just be floating up in the air. And that tends to happen with at least some international organizations. So we don't want to be that. So there's always constantly this flow of ideas, inspiration, voices from the ground. And then whatever happens at global levels going back to them. So this is very, very crucial.
Yeah. Is there anything else you didn't get a chance to say or talk about that you feel is really important to say? Any last kind of thoughts or
Well,
questions?
like I mentioned, maybe in passing, to respond to your earlier question, one absolutely crucial thing for GTA, other than what I just said about being rooted on the ground, is that it is led and we hope will continue to be led from the global south. Many of the international or global movements, and some very good ones, are emerging from the global north. And one is not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily make them bad or problematic, but we felt that the voices, the agency of the global south needs to be there in these global and to lead the global processes. And that's why even when we did the radical democracy gathering in South Africa, primarily it was people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which is not to then exclude Europe and North America, but to say that let's lead it from here, let's initiate it from here, and then make sure that sympathetic voices or voices of resistance from within the global north are also included and brought in. So maybe just adding that as an
Yeah,
additional.
yeah, most definitely. Um, well, I have so much respect for everything that y'all are doing. We are looking to y'all uh, just for inspiration and as we struggle with similar questions, right, in our communities. And I think in many ways, because we are, like you said, like we are in the belly of the beast, trying to do this work, all the more reason that that networks like Global Tapestry of Alternatives are so powerful in terms of an example of what can happen. And and we just thank you for your work and thank you for your time today speaking with us. It was really great talking with you. And
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks again for the opportunity, Marisol. And yeah, let's stay in touch.
To learn more about the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, you can visit globaltapestryofalternatives.org, where you can also sign up for their listserv. You can also support us, your local grassroots media, by reading and sharing our stuff and subscribing to our newsletter. As nonprofits of all kinds come under increasing attack, direct reader support becomes increasingly important. So if our work is helpful at all in what you do, please consider supporting us at Deceleration.news. Till next time, paz.